Hello, my name is Kathleen Quinlan. My specialty area is in education. I have a PhD in educational psychology from Stanford University, so I'm American. And I have a special focus in my research on learning and teaching and student development and faculty development in higher education. I've taught in Australian, American, and now English universities. I now teach and do research here at the University of Oxford. So I'll be speaking to you from my experience of having worked in universities in those three countries. We're going to be talking today about making the most of higher education in English-speaking countries. I've not lived in every single English-speaking country, mind you, but I have, as I said, worked in those three main contexts. I'm assuming that most of you are studying academic English, so I'm assuming that many of you are planning to pursue higher education in a country in a predominantly English-speaking country. So that might be the US, it might be the UK, it might be Australia, or Canada, or some other English-speaking country, Ireland. While there are significant differences in these settings, those are beyond the scope of our talk today. Rather, I want to talk about some of the fundamental underlying assumptions that underpin education across those various countries. In any of these settings, you will have the opportunity to create possibilities for yourself, to expand your own choices. You're starting down a path, as this image suggests. And while you may have some visions about what lies ahead, there'll be some surprises as well. You can't predict from here what might lie around the next bend on that journey. And what we would hope then is that you'll be alert to the unexpected, to those possibilities that will arise only through taking that journey. Through this lecture, I'm hoping that you will consider why you want to study in an English-speaking university. I want you to have a better understanding of what you can expect from a liberal university education. And I expect that you will gain some very specific recommendations and actions, strategies for enhancing your overseas education. To get the most from the lecture, I'd like you to take out a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. And I'm going to pause at various points during the lecture and ask you a reflection question. And I want you to take a moment at that point to write down some answers. Think about it, just jot down some answers. We won't have an opportunity today with such a large group to get feedback from all of you, but we will have a chance to talk about that in a tutorial setting. So save your answers for that discussion. Doing that will help you, though, to stay awake. We certainly want you to do that in the late afternoon. And it will also help to keep you focused on what we're talking about today and engage you in thinking about the key points. Once you've had a chance to think about these questions, you'll be better prepared to hear the kinds of responses that I'll be giving to those, some of which are drawn from key literature and key educational ideas. So you can watch for these reflection points. They're in red print on the slides, and they have a big red question mark on them. So that should give you a clue that we're at that point. While you will get some very practical tips on how to get the most from your university education through this talk, we must first understand the assumptions that underpin higher education in English-speaking countries. So I'll highlight some key ideas from the field of education and link those key assumptions back historically to its historical roots in ancient Greece. So the talk will also be theoretical. As a prominent educational researcher once said, nothing is as practical as a good theory. So we will have a very practical element even when we're talking about theory. And of course, by looking at theories of education, you'll get a taste of a typical lecture in the field of education. So our talk addresses three main questions today. What is university learning? How can you make the most of that educational experience? And what do you want to get out of a university education? So we'll turn to the first one first. First, we need to clarify the meaning of university learning. And we need to clarify the meaning of learning. We need to understand what it means from a variety of different theoretical perspectives. because the same idea or word means different things to different people. We can look at this example. If I say to you transportation, that's a quite simple word, a quite simple concept perhaps, and some of you are going to think about planes, some of you are going to envision buses, others of you will think about cars, and some will think about bicycles, and who knows what else you might be thinking when I say transportation. So the same is true of the word learning. When I say we're going to learn something, you might have quite different pictures about what that means, what it will result in, and how to go about it. So your first reflection question is, very briefly, to think about what does it mean to learn something? How do you know then if you have learned something? So take just a minute and think about that. All right, good. Now let's take a look at some research that outlines a variety of different conceptions of learning that are commonly held and how those relate to what is expected in universities. From the literature on learning, we can describe two main conceptions of learning. The first is represented here by this pile of rocks on the left-hand side. This is a representation of learning as a quantitative increase in knowledge. So just like the stones in this pile of rocks, it sort of envisions learning as a pile of things, a pile of facts, or a pile of theories, accumulated one on top of another. A second major way of looking at learning is to view it as some kind of a change process, as a process of transformation or qualitative change. And the images here suggest that you could look at a tree in a variety of different ways, and that you'll have a changed perception of that tree as you do so. So in the first picture, you might look at a tree and see a branching in different directions, looking up the trunk. But if you take another perspective and you look more closely, then you see something quite different. Here you see a close-up of the bark of that tree. And if you look even more closely, you'll find a little surprise in here. On the right-hand side, you'll see a little face that looks like a monkey. So by changing our way of looking at things, we can go from seeing a tree right down to seeing the face of a little monkey. So that's quite a difference in perspective. So those are the two main ways of looking at this. Salyer, who is part of a major research group that's had a lot of influence on the way we think about learning and teaching in higher education, he and his colleagues in Gothenburg in Sweden did some research on university students, asking them what their conceptions of learning were. And he came up with 5 major conceptions of learning, which can be broken into these two rough categories we just talked about. So the first 3 of the conceptions that he noticed were related to seeing learning as a quantitative increase. So at the very lowest levels of that, it's literally that pile of rocks view, that one thing on top of another accumulation. A second framework for thinking about it is, a second way of looking at learning is memorizing. So in this view, we're seeing learning as a way of storing information that can be reproduced later. A third way of looking at it is to see it as acquiring facts, skills, and methods that can be retained and used later. So not just spitting it back out for a test, but actually being able to apply it. So I could give you an example from my own experience of viewing learning as a quantitative increase. When I was in school, as a young person, about 12 years old, I'd learned a lot of vocabulary. Week after week after week, we studied vocabulary, and I tended to think of that as just increasing, adding another word and another word and another word to my repertoire. And we had to memorize those for the tests, and each week we were quizzed, and we had to spell it properly, and we had to describe what the meaning of it was. And yes, I did realize that if I remembered this and retained this, that I could apply it. I could use this vocabulary in my writing, for example, and sometimes I did. But still, I was still seeing this as a quantitative increase. Another way of looking at things is a more qualitative change, which is not really what I did with my own vocabulary tests when I was 12 years old, but I did start to think about it more, start to experience learning as a qualitative change as an adult. For example, when I was studying geological terms, I lived in an area that was formed by glaciers, and I learned some terms that described glacial landscapes. Words like esker and kettle ponds and erratics, rather. And that those, by understanding those words and learning those words and appreciating them and connecting them to the landscapes around me, I could start to see the landscape differently. I could start to see the story of how that landscape was formed. So in this case, I was doing more than just memorizing those words. I was making sense of them. I was abstracting some meaning that connected to my own world, the world around me. So by relating these things and making those relationships, I was experiencing learning in a much more qualitative way. I was experiencing a change in my world and my ability to experience that world. The last of these qualitative changes is about interpreting and understanding reality in a different way. So again, if we go back to my example from geology, I had looked for years at a point of land jutting out into a lake. I'd simply seen it as a point of land with some houses on it and some trees. But by learning the term esker, I could then start to see that not just as a point of land in this lake today, but I could start to imagine the stream flowing under a glacier or through a glacier that created that landscape, that created what I was looking at. So I saw it as a stream bed, an ancient stream bed, rather than just a point of land. So I was able to interpret and understand reality in a different way. So these are some 5 different ways of thinking about learning. Some of those may match with what you've written down, and we can talk more about those later. And it may be that you have written down other things, which might be an extension of knowledge in this field. So that brings me to the end of the talk. We've talked about 3 main questions. What is university learning? How you can improve, how you can make the most of your education, and ultimately what benefits you might expect from it. So you've started down an important path. It's a powerful path, and I wish you all the best with that. May you enjoy the journey. It will be a challenging one, and benefit from the options that it opens up to you, whatever those might be around the bend.
Today's lecture is going to be entitled Sustainable Living, Changing Aspects of Urbanisation and Consumption. What my research and teaching does is look at levels and styles of urban living. In particular, I'm looking at aspects of sustainable development and consumption in the way we live today in urban areas. The world's residents are in general young and poor and living in cities, and are part of an unequal and unsustainable network of global production and consumption. So over the next 40 minutes, we'll be looking across early ideas of urbanisation, looking at aspects of sustainable development, and then looking at how ideas of consumption and production fit into this matrix, and how then we can go back to looking at ways of sustainable living in cities today. So, first of all, what does the 31st of October mean to you? It's an important birthday. And it'd be interesting if you think for a moment, if you can know why this date is significant. A slight clue here is the birthday announced of Adam Nevik on the 12th of October 1999 in Sarajevo in Bosnia. And a particular date we're looking at is the 31st of October 2011. Now this date was announced, the UN announced that it was the day of the 7th billionth living person to be born. And in 1999, 12 years ago, the UN announced the name of a single baby born in Sarajevo to commemorate this landmark occasion of him being the 6th billionth person being born. Whereas in October 2011, the UN didn't announce a single baby, but said this is an important day, a day in general where you can note that the world population has passed 7 billion people. Now, there's many cases where population growth is seen as problematic. It raises a lot of concern in the media. Academics and scientists for many decades have considered the problems and the advantages of demographic growth. But when we look at this figure today of 7 billion people having lived in the world, we'll notice one thing. First of all, if we think in the years ahead, it's predicted that in 14 years' time it will be the 8th billionth person, and after that, in another 18 years, it will be the 9th billionth person. Now that would seem a dramatic figure, a dramatic growth. But what we're really looking at here is not so much a demographic growth that's out of control, but actually population increase is slowing down. And what is happening to the world's population by and large, yes, it's increasing, but really what we're concerned today, if we're looking at development issues, if we're looking at issues of sustainability, is not so much the number of people living in the world, but their distribution and the access of these world residents to resources for social, economic and physical resource consumption. So the news around October 2011 brought a lot of attention to this notion of a demographic increase. And as you can see on the graph, towards the end of the graph it goes right up to 10 billion, but you'll see the curve of the graph is slowing off. And that's what we're talking about to some ways today, the fact that population is increasing, but that increase is not intrinsically what we're concerned about. We're concerned about where people live and how they're living. A majority of the world's population are living in cities. So that's why we're focusing on sustainable cities and looking at those aspects of urbanization and the consumption patterns of people globally, but particularly within those urban areas. Now, if you are politically engaged, and if you are interested in global leaders, you may have noticed that the birthday we've selected, the 4th of August 1961, is the birthday of Barack Obama, the President of the USA. And you'll notice that when he was born 50 years ago, there are around just over 3 billion people in the world. So in President Obama's lifespan, the world has more than doubled. And really, these are the issues of governance that we're looking at today globally, as well as at state level, but also at city, municipal level.
Now, another point to bear in mind is that the UN is not just the Security Council or the General Assembly or the Secretariat. These are three principal organs of the UN, to be sure, but the UN is a family of bodies that also includes the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, the International Labour Organization, UNESCO, and the World Health Organization, among many others. For purposes of this lecture, I'm going to be concentrating on the Security Council, but you mustn't think that that's all there is to the UN.
So, in the UN, of the complex web of human rights mechanisms the world over, local, national, regional, and international, I'm going to focus only at the international. I'm not going to look at the UN as a whole and how all of its activities everywhere should have human rights as part of their concern. I'm going to focus narrowly on what we call the UN human rights mechanisms. And we said they're of two types, treaty and charter. I'm going to only focus on the charter-based bodies.
Brilliant. So today we are going to focus this lecture on community ecology. But first of all, we must recap what is ecology. So it's the study of interactions between organisms and their environments. And I have this array of leaflets around the outside just to show the sheer scope that ecology covers, especially in terms of the scale, from molecular through to the landscape level.
Now that would seem a dramatic figure, a dramatic growth. But what we're really looking at here is not so much a demographic growth that's out of control, but actually population increase is slowing down. And what is happening to the world's population by and large, yes, it's increasing, but really what we're concerned today, if we're looking at development issues, if we're looking at issues of sustainability, is not so much the number of people living in the world, but their distribution and the access of these world residents to resources for social, economic and physical resource consumption. So I'm just going to focus in the next few minutes on one school of thought on sustainable cities and sustainable urban living, and that is new urbanism. It evolved really in the last 2 decades in North America and Europe, but again it sort of highlights some of the aspects of sustainable living, sustainable urban living that have been underpinning much of the literature and research over the last 2 decades. The Congress for New Urbanism in North America is set up principally to promote forms of sustainable but also traditional urban design, and again we can see some of the principles they outline match very closely with some of the wider principles of sustainable city design. So again, the new urbanists would argue that sense of place, community building, really lies at the core of creating a socially sustainable neighbourhood. In terms of planning design, they look at interconnected street grid networks, but principally create cities and neighbourhoods in which the streets are livable. They arrange in compact, walkable blocks or areas to encourage that form of sustainable movement and to encourage walkable spaces. The new urbanist movements will argue that housing choices should be varied to encourage a social mix of people within an area, to go away from what Engels looked at as the separate palaces of the rich and the slums of the poor. Argue that a social mix, an economic mix, is really one of the key aspects of creating a livable neighbourhood. New urbanists also say that modern design should be of high quality. It should last beyond 25 years. So the notion of you're building for the next century, not for the next 25-year profit cycle. And again, if you're a geographer, you'll be focusing on place and space. And again, the new urbanists argue that when you're designing a town, it should be at a scale that really allows the easy access to educational, social and commercial facilities that can be walked, that are walkable, where you can use public transport and you're not relying on the car. And finally, there's a notion that urban areas to be designed with a human scale in mind, that increasing public spaces, the more shared spaces that people can mix and integrate, really will create a more socially aware and socially sustainable society. Now, the new urbanists have been critiqued for being too utopian. In many ways, we'll look at a couple of examples where their urban designs have created some very positive, but also maybe some more challenging aspects of a new urbanist process. But as David Harvey has mentioned in Spaces of Hope, he said that really utopia is a key aspect for human development, that without utopia, if humans don't strive for a utopia, they'll never really continue. That progress really relies on utopia, and it's a failure of gaining that utopian landscape is what drives on the next generation. So you need utopias, you need to dream in order to progress in social terms. So we're going to look at 2 examples of New Urbanist School. The first one is in Seaside. It's become a very well-known city, a well-known urban development, largely because it was a film setting for The Truman Show, which became a Hollywood film, which in many ways created an ideal living urban environment. And the producers of the film visited Seaside and thought they were walking into a film set, the film set they'd been trying to design previously. Now, Seaside was one of the first developments of the New Urbanist School, and it was designed along the principles outlined in terms of small-scale neighbourhood development. It was first really discussed or mooted in the late 70s, and in the 1980s it was fully developed, in process to be developed, in creating certain forms of livability, walkability in Florida. The idea was to create a small town neighbourhood with a projected population around 2,000 people. This was deemed to be similar to the townships in USA, in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. It was again to have a mixed form of land use, to create that mixed social economic neighbourhood that arguably would make a city more pleasant to live in. And as you can see, they are utopian in vision. They are referring to maybe a notion of North American living, very clean streets, white picket fences, and we'll discuss some of the aspects of that form of new urbanism that have been critiqued in the following slide. Celebration in Florida, for those of you who know Disneyland, was developed in the early 90s as part of an urban generation project inspired again by new urbanism. And again, it follows the same principles of walkability, high quality urban design, mixed neighborhoods. And you can see it presents an image, particularly of an image of North American townscape that many would find attractive. But as you'll notice, although there are different urban design, different building designs, there are also a variety of residents, arguably in its planning, but you'll notice there's quite a strong level of uniformity. And in some ways, the new urbanism have been critiqued because they are looking at urban design, they're looking at traditional ideas, almost some have argued quaint ideas of urban design, but there's a certain conformity there. So you'll notice that all the picket fences are white, and you'll notice there's a level of conformity within difference. And one of the aspects of living in this area is you also sign up to if you will, a social code, a form of conduct. So if you wanted to paint your fence a different colour or your door a different colour, then that again probably would not be seen to be fitting, and you have to conform to the certain laws of the neighbourhood. So although many aspects of new urbanist design do fit into the wider aspects of creating a sustainable city, a sustainable city, in many cases that comes with forms of control. And so again, that has been seen as problematic. Also, the notion of having a city in which a variety of social groups may live becomes problematic when you're working within a market economy. And many of these desirable residents are indeed desired, and many of the houses now are really only affordable as vacation homes for the relatively wealthy. So in some ways, the principle in design has worked very well, but in terms of the reality, the market economy has created some would argue, a gentrified community that really doesn't reflect some of the social mixing that new urbanist or sustainable forms of development would encourage. And this has been reflected in some of the critiques of new urbanist development. Particularly Scully has argued that one cannot help but hope that the lessons of Seaside and of other new towns now taking shape can be applied to the problem of housing for the poor. That is where community is most needed and where it has been most destroyed. So again, we're going back to the issues of the social matrix of a city. That sustainable development isn't purely looking at urban design, it's not focusing on the economic or environmental aspects alone, it's the social aspect which many would argue is the most important form of creating a livable city and a sustainable city.
Okay, hello, my name's Jenny Tilley and I'm a biomaterials scientist at the University of Oxford. And today I'm going to talk to you about 3 materials that I think will play an important, if somewhat controversial role at London 2012 next year. Now, Olympic fever is building as people around the world anticipate the thrill of watching world-class athletes push their bodies to the limits in order to be faster, higher, stronger. But as a materials scientist, I have to wonder whether athletes would break so many records without the help of us materials scientists. So what is materials science? Well, materials science is the study of what gives materials their very specific properties. How can we play with the structure and composition of a material in order to control its properties? It's a subject that sits at the interface of science and engineering. We need scientists who understand all about atoms and atomic structure, and we need engineers who understand all about massive structures like bridges, cars, nuclear reactors. It also covers a very diverse range of topics. We have chemists, physicists, and mathematicians, but we also have biologists, biochemists, computer scientists, and design technologists. And we all cover real-life issues. We're all concerned with those things that affect the world around us every day. So what do material scientists really do? Well, we can be split into two categories, those of science and those of engineering. And the scientists are concerned with controlling the atomic structure, so arranging atoms in a material and adding new atoms of maybe a different material in order to control the properties. And the main properties that they're concerned with are those of mechanical strength. So I have a picture on here of some carbon fibre, and you can see some fibres aligned in one direction and fibres aligned in another direction. And so carbon fibre is able to be strong in two directions. We're also concerned with the electrical properties. So I also have a picture on here of some carbon nanowires. Now these are made of atoms all arranged into very tiny little wires, and that means that they conduct electricity in one direction, which is exactly what we want from wires. And then I also have a picture up here about optical properties. And what I've got is a glass beaker made by the Romans that in normal light looks green, but when I put a candle inside it, shines red. And the reason for that is that the Romans added some tiny, tiny little particles, nanoparticles, of gold, and this changes the optical properties of the glass beaker. Now, what about materials in sport? Well, the sporting world has changed significantly in the past century, and one of the key examples of that is the Paralympics. The Paralympics were introduced after World War II to give war veterans a sporting event that they could participate in. No one actually managed to run the 100-metre sprint in the Paralympics until about 1952. In 1976, a double amputee ran the 100-metre sprint in 42.3 seconds. Absolutely amazing. I can't imagine how he must have felt. So I wonder how he'd feel now, knowing that a double amputee runs the 100-metre sprint in 10.91 seconds, just over a second slower than Usain Bolt, an Olympian. And it's not just in the Paralympics that things are changing. As you can see from the graph, over the past century, we've slowly been knocking 0.1 of a second off the time it takes to run the 100-metre sprint at the Olympics. In 2008, Usain Bolt ran the 100-metre sprint in 9.81 seconds. Last year, he ran it in 9.64 seconds. In 2012, he's hoping to run it in 9.5 seconds. And so the question has got to be, how is he doing it? And it's not just sprinters who are getting faster. Weightlifters are lifting more weight, canoeists are canoeing faster, jumpers are jumping further and higher. And so there really has to be this question, how are they doing it? Well, you could argue that it's the athlete's ability and dedication that's changed. Since 1981, fully professional athletes have been allowed to compete in the Olympic Games. So now those who get the decent sponsorship deals are able to dedicate every waking and sleeping moment of their lives to pushing their bodies to the limits. But as a scientist, I have to argue that it's actually the scientific advances in the past century that have played a more important role. Now, these can be broadly split into those of biomechanical engineering and materials science. Biomechanical engineering is that study of how we move our bodies and how we could move our bodies more efficiently in order to be faster. Maybe you don't lift your arm out of the water as far when you're swimming front crawl. Maybe you need to move your feet in a slightly different way when you're running the 100-metre sprint. It's quite complex, but it manages to shave 0.1 of the second off times. But as a materials scientist, I actually have to argue that materials science advances in the past century have played an even more significant role. Gone are the days where men ran around dirt tracks wearing plimsolls and baggy sports clothing. The Olympics are a material world. And so I present to you my 3 medal-winning materials. Now, it turns out the use of polyurethane can be quite controversial. Whether you swim or whether you don't, you've probably heard of a man called Michael Phelps, a medal-winning American swimmer. Now in this picture you can see Michael Phelps in the middle, flanked by two fellow competitors at the 2009 World Championships. And you can see that they're all wearing funny swimsuits. It looks a bit like they're wearing wetsuits. What they're actually wearing is a polyurethane swimsuit. Polyurethane swimsuits were introduced because they reduce drag through the water, and they also, because it's a very light material, increase buoyancy, so your hips are further up in the water than the rest of your body, so it feels like you're swimming downhill. And the other thing they do is they compress your body because they're very tight swimsuits, and so they reduce your drag through the water even more because they compress your hips, the bits that stick out and slow you down in the water. Now, when these suits were first introduced, people put them on and automatically started knocking seconds off their personal best. At the 2009 World Championships, over 32 events, over 43 world records were broken. In other words, these suits are so effective that not only were they breaking records in the finals, they were breaking records in the heats in the run-up to the finals. These suits are just amazing. However, in 2010, the governing body of swimming determined that these polyurethane suits were the equivalent of steroids. They were introducing too significant an increase in speed, and they banned them from use in any subsequent competition. Now, in 2008, all the world records were set wearing these swimsuits. And so at the 2012 Olympics, how likely is it that we're going to see records smashed?
Okay, so I mean, section 1 is the one that says number 1, and then section 3 is like... Hello, and thank you for your interest in our poster. I'm Carolina Burkwart. This is Ben Foster.
Hello.
And we'd like to just talk you through the main ideas of our poster, which we've been working on. So, over to Ben to start.
Thanks, Carolina. Well, what we're going to be looking at is knowledge transfer, which is also known as KT, and the changing nature of KT and some of the challenges associated with it. So first of all, KT is basically the exchange and dissemination of knowledge, particularly the change in information. KT is increasingly being recognised as being a valuable activity, particularly for researchers and developers in universities.
That's right. And actually, KT is at the heart of most activities at universities, if you think about it. Lecturers and professors are disseminating knowledge and information, not only to their students through lectures and seminars, but also to a wider audience through their publications, especially online.
And increasingly, publications are reaching a truly global audience.
Exactly, yes. In the past, publications tended to be more restricted in their reach, whereas nowadays they're essentially global in terms of their access and also in terms of their authors, the researchers who write for them.
And this brings us on to our next point, which is the emergence of open access journals. Open access journals basically means free at the point of use. So students or the general public can access these journals in electronic form, directly without having to pay for them. Obviously, this is in contrast to the more traditional model, which was on a payment basis. Journals were published in print form only, which can be expensive, obviously, because you have to pay for them. So it was usually the university libraries that subscribed to them for the benefit of their students, rather than individuals.
Okay, so as Ben says, things have changed, and there are a lot of issues here. Although access is free, it's very important to maintain quality. So the content, the papers, the articles, these are still peer-reviewed. In other words, other researchers from the same subject area review the content, checking it for accuracy, reliability, quality, those sorts of things.
That's right. And one other area we wanted to look at was plagiarism. One advantage of the fact that basically all articles are now available electronically. One advantage is that it's much easier to detect when something has been plagiarised using anti-plagiarism software. And another area is innovation. Universities need to look at what they do in terms of innovation.
Well, just before we look at innovation, I think we should just talk about our central idea here. Basically, if I could just explain this cycle here. So this starts with direct investment in educational research. Now, this investment could come from a government agency, like a higher education council, something like that. Or alternatively, it may come from industry, because increasingly, companies are choosing to invest in aspects of university research that have economic potential. So this means increased levels of research at universities because there's more funding available, and the emergence of more high-tech companies developing the ideas that come out of that research. So the next stage in our diagram is an increase in economic competitiveness. The local economy surrounding the university benefits, resulting in economic growth. And finally, all this economic growth, all this activity should lead to more funding, more money becoming available for research at universities, in other words. Ben, did you want to talk about that at all?
Well, looking at the time, I think we probably should move on. KT is increasingly being recognised as being a valuable activity, particularly for researchers and developers in universities. And increasingly, publications are reaching a truly global audience.
Exactly, yes. In the past, publications tended to be more restricted in their reach, whereas nowadays they're essentially global in terms of their access and also in terms of their authors, the researchers who write for them.
Obviously, this is in contrast to the more traditional model, which was on a payment basis. Journals were published in print form only, which can be expensive, obviously, because you have to pay for them.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. It says in Part 5 that Britain must invest more strongly than in the past in its knowledge base and translate this knowledge more effectively into business and public service innovation.
Yes.
What does that mean exactly? Are you suggesting that universities are all about turning knowledge and education into business and profit?
Well, no, actually this quotation is from the Science and Innovation Investment Framework.
Yes, I can see that, but...
Well, so I think what it's saying is that universities are expensive, but they are an essential part of a country's knowledge base. They're also really important in terms of innovation. They're where innovation begins. As the quote says, innovation is essential to Britain's growth and economic development.
Okay, but is that what universities are for primarily? What about knowledge for its own sake?
Well, I don't think they're saying we shouldn't have knowledge for their own sake, but I think they're saying that we need to invest more in the university sector.
Okay. Could I ask something else? I was wondering if you could explain why you've included this other quotation. It says, dangers in positioning university research too close to market and thereby crowding out company innovation and undermining its value. How does that fit in with what you just said?
Well, okay, good question. What this means, as far as I understand it, universities have a more central part to play in research and creating value and so on. But they should remember that they are primarily universities, not companies. They're about learning. They need to focus more on the more traditional areas like research, ideas, knowledge, and leave the companies to more market-based activities and products.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, another question.
Yes. How do you see the future of knowledge transfer and, in particular, publishing in, say, 5 years compared with today?
Me?
Either of you.
Well, Carolina, do you want to answer that?
Thanks. Okay, I would say that there'll be a bigger investment in digital publishing, obviously, and to some extent open access publishing. But I think the biggest, most powerful publishing houses will probably stay focused on value. They're not going to give content away for nothing. So there could well be a divergence. On the one hand, there'll be free, open access publishing, and on the other, more restricted, expensive publishing, more valuable, higher quality content for those who can pay for it.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks.
So the second thing I want to talk about is the fact that you have long swings in the global economy, something I've hinted at, in that I've just been describing the whole era of the 1980s, 1990s and beyond, starting with Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in America, deregulating the financial sector. That was a long swing, 30-year era which came to an end. But we've seen those long eras before. In the 1920s, following the First World War, there was an era of laissez-faire, economic orthodoxy, similarly allowing speculation to take place, which led to the 1929 Wall Street crash and subsequent Great Depression. And it was only emerging out of the Second World War that there was a feeling that that couldn't be allowed to happen again. We had to have regulation on a global scale, but also nationally. And that's what was put in place in 1945, globally, with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, fixed exchange rates, but also domestically in most countries with public ownership, public regulation, and so forth. And that led to what has been described as the golden age of capitalism, 1945 to 1973, almost 30 years, which saw more sustained economic growth and development than had ever been seen before or has been seen since. Following the turbulence of the 1970s, where there was high inflation, it seemed like the previous economic policies weren't working. We've had this 30 years of deregulation, capitalism unleashed, from 1979 through to the 2009 global recession. So what do we do about it? Well, in 2008, when it was clear that this was a really huge systemic crisis across the globe, national governments in Britain, across Europe, in America did act quite forcefully, nationalising banks and also putting huge amount of government demand into the economy, as Keynes had urged in the 1930s. Keynes, probably one of the greatest and best known economists ever, did most of his work between the wars in Britain, became famous at first after the First World War, when Britain and France were imposing large reparations on Germany, saying that Germany would have to pay back Britain and France for the damage the First World War had caused. Keynes warned that that was economically wrong and therefore probably would lead to political suicide as well, because the German economy would not be able to pay back these reparations. So it would be self-defeating. The demand to pay back the reparations would actually prevent the German economy recovering. You'd have wide-scale unemployment locked in, and that was bound to lead to political and social problems, on which, of course, unfortunately, he was proved correct. In Britain in the 1920s, Britain did rejoin the gold standard, which again Keynes warned against, saying that was just old economic orthodoxy and it would not work. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, actually, who took Britain back onto the gold standard then, was called Winston Churchill, who then went on to become Prime Minister and led Britain during the Second World War. And so after the First World War, when Keynes wrote his first famous pamphlet called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he warned that the peace agreement after the First World War would cause political dangers later on, because it was unsustainable to try and force a weak economy, as Germany then was after the First World War, to repay huge reparations. When Winston Churchill then took Britain back onto the gold standard, Keynes wrote another pamphlet saying the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill, warning that again would lead to British goods become uncompetitive, because he said the real world just doesn't work like the textbooks say. The textbooks say doesn't matter if goods become uncompetitive, because you can just reduce prices by cutting wages. And Keynes warned that the world just doesn't work like that. It's very difficult to just cut wages, drop prices and so on. And so it proved again in Britain. That led to the general strike of 1926. And then most famously in 1936, Keynes published his major work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, where he basically said that economies don't naturally return to equilibrium and full employment, it's quite possible for them to get stuck in recession, depression, with large-scale unemployment. That was the first thing he said, which was quite radical at the time. Might seem obvious, might seem now that it would have been obvious in 1936 when there was large-scale unemployment as a result of the Great Depression, but nevertheless economic orthodoxy then was still saying, no, just cut the budget deficit and everything else will follow. Keynes warned, no, actually cutting the budget deficit in that situation makes matters worse, not better, because the only thing which is going to lead to recovery is people spending money. In a depression, consumers aren't spending money. It's hard to export if it's a global recession. Companies won't be investing because they don't think that the markets are there. So the only other possible source of demand is government spending. And that was one of the key lessons from the general theory. And Keynes said it must be government spending, not just quantitative easing, as it's called today, or having low interest rates. It can't just be monetary policy, which was the orthodoxy. Well, if you have lots of money, then people will borrow and then spend that. Keynes said that you can't force people to borrow, and if people aren't optimistic about the future, then companies won't borrow to invest because they won't believe they'll be able to sell the goods and services they produce. So Keynes likened having a low interest rate in that situation, or monetary policy in general in that situation, as like pushing on a string. You might be doing it, but will have no effect elsewhere because people won't be taking up the offer of loans in order to invest. So Keynes said you must use fiscal policy, which was what the leading governments around the world did in 2008 and did prevent that recession from being greater than it was.
From early times, many historians have looked at the living and working conditions of the urban poor. Friedrich Engels, in the turn of the middle of the 19th century, wrote about the condition of the working class in England. Now, this was a time of a peak, really, of the Industrial Revolution. In many ways, a moment of great industrial wealth and productivity for the British economy at the time, but Marx and Engels, his co-worker, noted the great levels of poverty amongst many of the working class people. So in his book, written in 1845, called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, Friedrich Engels looked very closely at the city structures, and he noted, every great city has one or more slums where the working class is crowded together. True, poverty often dwells in hidden alleys close to the palaces of the rich, but in general, a separate territory has been assigned to it, where, removed from the sight of the happier classes, it may struggle along as it can.
Our lecture is going to be about the UN human rights machinery. But I'm going to focus on one of the newer bodies of the UN human rights machinery, which is the Human Rights Council, and also a very new procedure, which is called the Universal Periodic Review. I think I'm going to point out some of the changes that have occurred organizationally to the UN human rights mechanisms, and point out the innovation that is captured within this new mechanism called Universal Periodic Review. So we see something of the Human Rights Council here. We should recall that the body I'm going to focus this lecture on is one where there are hundreds of people in one room. They are meeting for at least 10 weeks a year. We have the presence of high-level delegations from governments. We have very senior diplomats that would be in this council focusing their sole attention on human rights at the international level. And there will be a media presence. There are non-governmental organizations there. And, amongst them also victim groups, those whose human rights have been violated or their representatives. Now, the human rights machinery at the UN level is quite complicated, and we shouldn't be too narrow in how we capture and understand this. The reason I say this is that almost every UN agency, or whether at the local level, regional level, national level, or international level, every UN body should be concerned with human rights amongst its other activities. So whether it's a monetary agency, whether it's a development agency, whether it's working with, let's say, maternal health or child nutrition or working in conflict, all UN activities should have human rights as part of their agenda, whether overtly so or whether, as a part of a range of concerns, including health and, eradicating polio or whatever it is. Nevertheless, when we talk about the UN human rights mechanisms, we mean some particular mechanisms. We're not talking about when the Security Council acts taking note of human rights violations in a country. We're not really talking about the World Health Organization. So in the narrower sense, the UN human rights mechanisms are of two types. One are charter-based bodies and the other are treaty-based bodies. And the distinction here is really quite simple. Treaty-based bodies draw their origin, their reason for being, their creation to particular treaties that governments have been involved in drafting. They have voluntarily become bound by that treaty, just like any other treaty works. And because of accepting and ratifying that treaty, then they are obliged to respect it and report what progress they have made in realizing its objectives. So it's a treaty, it happens to have a human rights focus. And in the UN human rights mechanisms, we have 9 core human rights treaties. The treaties are not what I'm going to talk about today. It's the second prong of, or type of human rights mechanism, and these are the charter-based bodies. So these bodies are the ones that were created by virtue of the UN Charter in 1945, saying that one of the objectives of the United Nations was to ensure not only peace and stability, but also human rights. And just from that one commitment in 1945, over the past 6 to 7 decades, we have seen the evolution of a range of bodies to try to realize that UN Charter objective. So in the UN, of the complex web of human rights mechanisms the world over, local, national, regional, and international, I'm going to focus only at the international. I'm not going to look at the UN as a whole and how all of its activities everywhere should have human rights as part of their concern. I'm going to focus narrowly on what we call the UN human rights mechanisms. And we said they're of two types, treaty and charter. I'm going to only focus on the charter-based bodies. So, when we moved from the Commission to the Council, we also adopted a decision to have a new procedure called the Universal Periodic Review. The resolution that brought this decision into being, into force, said that Universal Periodic Review, I'm going to call it UPR from now on, UPR is the fulfillment by each state of its human rights obligations and commitments, a cooperative mechanism based on an interactive dialogue. It sounds pretty good, the fulfillment of every state of all its human rights obligations and commitments. Who would be against that? That seems a great idea. So the objectives of Universal Periodic Review, UPR, is first of all to assess positive developments, but also challenges. So it wants to be balanced. It will assess the fulfillment of each member state of the United Nations, of its obligations and commitments in the field of human rights. It can share good practice because all the states will be reviewed and therefore they can learn from each other and share experiences about, let's say, the challenge of racism. Especially, we see around us how austerity seems to have given rise to a push to the right, and with that, unfortunately, we see in many states more racist organizations gathering support and becoming more vocal. So this is a shared challenge at the global level. It rears its ugly head all too often. And, states can really share with each other that, whilst respecting privacy, whilst respecting freedom of opinion or expression, how do you deal with the scourge of racism? When the state lacks capacity, money, and expertise to improve its human rights situation, and, we're not talking about only civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. So social benefits, training for employment, child literacy, maternal health, etc., all these require expertise, require money, and in many states where this experience and financial ability or infrastructure is lacking. I mean, in all human rights, if you want to track developments, you need detailed statistics. And gathering detailed statistics and disaggregating them according to age, so distinguishing. So let's look at literacy. We need to know the male and female. We need to know the minority populations. We need to know the border regions. We need to know the deprived areas. We need to know how illiteracy breaks down according to boys and girls, according to different age groups. That requires some expertise. And UPR, along with welcoming positive developments and raising issues of concern, is also able to offer technical assistance to the state if that indeed is the reason why there hasn't been an improvement in the human rights situation on the ground. So it's quite a well-rounded package within that mechanism. Now, this is the first time we have mobilized a procedure that looks at the human rights situation of all 193 members of the UN on an equal basis. It gives them exactly the same allocation of funding, time, and the examination is on exactly the same basis. Exactly the same pattern is used for a country of 1.3 billion population or a country of, let's say, 300,000 population. Seems bizarre, but on the other hand, if we're living in a world of sovereign states, all states are equal, therefore they have equal obligation and should be equally responsive to their obligations and commitments in the field of human rights. So if we look at it in terms of sovereign equality, then it's quite right that they should be treated equally, even though if you were looking at it in terms of population, it seems bizarre to give exactly the same attention to 1.3 billion as a few 100,000. But the system as we have it is each of the 193 member states will be reviewed every 4 years. That means around 48 states per year. The aim for it is not to surprise the states and just launch into criticism. It's a cooperative mechanism. It should be based on reliable information. So the information has been sifted, it's been summarized into a standard format. It's an intergovernmental process. So primarily, one state is under review and other states are making recommendations to it. And the state which is under review is fully involved. So if you're concerned with the universal enjoyment of human rights, if you are concerned with the advocacy for human rights, you might have your favorites: human right, freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, the right to education, etc., if you are concerned with the domestic impact of international commitments or have concerns about particular violations, then UPR is one procedure that gives us a very broad assessment about human rights situations in all 193 states every 4 years. Now, I said that the pattern being used for assessment is identical. So is the basis. I mean, on what basis are you going to review Brazil and Monaco, Liechtenstein and the People's Republic of China? Well, on exactly the same basis. So it's on the basis of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the human rights treaties that the state has ratified. Because if it's not ratified them, it's not bound by them. That's the legality comes from the ratification. Any additional voluntary commitments and pledges, and taking note of applicable international humanitarian law. So if there are situations of conflict, then that body of law is also applied. Just to end, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that the Universal Periodic Review has great potential to promote and protect human rights in the darkest corners of the world. And I think this statement is quite profound on many levels. First of all, some small states had never received the attention of the UN human rights mechanisms. They either weren't bad enough, or they were too remote, or no non-governmental organizations had produced a report on that country. I mean, so some states and some regions of the world received a lot less attention than others. So first of all, we get a global picture through UPR. Secondly, by the state being able to both accept and reject the recommendations, we see where the state explicitly doesn't have commitment regarding human rights. And thirdly, and most importantly, I think we see every 4 years how the state has lived up to those commitments. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Richard Kaplan. I'm Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. I'll be lecturing today on the United Nations and international security. For purposes of this lecture, I'm going to be referring to the UN Charter. Charters and constitutions are the very foundations of organizations, whether it's the European Union, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian States, the African Union, or FIFA, the International Football Association for that matter. Charters and constitutions tell us a lot about the basic principles of an organization and how that organization works or should work, and the UN Charter is no exception in this regard. Of course, practice doesn't always conform to theory, and here too the UN's no exception, but nevertheless the UN is a useful starting point for gaining an appreciation of the role of the organization in the arena of international security, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. I'll be showing you excerpts from the Charter in my lecture today. But before we turn to this Charter, let me start with a few basic facts about the UN. First of all, the UN is an organization made up of member states, 193 member states to be precise. Nearly every state in the world is a member of the United Nations. The near universality of the UN arguably gives it greater legitimacy than its predecessor organization, the League of Nations, had. The United States was not a member of the League, nor was the Soviet Union initially, and their absence from the League, it could be argued, hampered its effectiveness. Now, although virtually all states in the world are members of the UN is not a world government. The UN is what we call an intergovernmental organization, which is to say that sovereign authority remains, for the most part, with the member states. That means the UN can only do what its members allow it to do. And this is important because when the UN fails to take effective action, as it failed to do with respect to the humanitarian atrocities being committed in Bosnia and Herzegovina or Rwanda in the 1990s, it's not the UN itself that bears responsibility, but rather the UN's member states. Now, that doesn't mean that the UN as an organization has no autonomous powers. The Secretary General has some, as we'll see later, but the autonomy of the UN tends to be exaggerated. Now, another point to bear in mind is that the UN is not just the Security Council or the General Assembly or the Secretariat. These are three principal organs of the UN, to be sure, but the UN is a family of bodies that also includes the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, the International Labour Organization, UNESCO, and the World Health Organization, among many others. For purposes of this lecture, I'm going to be concentrating on the Security Council, but you mustn't think that that's all there is to the UN. Now, what's the purpose of the UN? Here it's useful to turn to the Charter. Article 1.1 tells us that one of the purposes of the UN, and I would argue the primary purpose, is to maintain international peace and security. It also says that towards that end, member states will take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace. Now, it's the bit about collective measures that I want to focus on for a moment. The UN is a collective security organization. What exactly does that mean? The idea behind collective security is that all members of the organization agree to join forces to protect any one of its members from the unlawful use of force by any one or several states. Now, I'll come back to the distinction between lawful and unlawful use of force a little bit later. The UN is not a world government. The UN is what we call an intergovernmental organization, which is to say that sovereign authority remains, for the most part, with the member states. That means the UN can only do what its members allow it to do. And this is important because when the UN fails to take effective action, as it failed to do with respect to the humanitarian atrocities being committed in Bosnia and Herzegovina or Rwanda in the 1990s, it's not the UN itself that bears responsibility, but rather the UN's member states. Now, that doesn't mean that the UN as an organization has no autonomous powers. The Secretary General has some, as we'll see later, but the autonomy of the UN tends to be exaggerated. So, we've been through the major provisions of the UN Charter that deal with international security. But what about peacekeeping? You know, the blue helmets. Probably the most visible contribution of the UN to international security. Where does peacekeeping figure in the UN Charter? Well, it doesn't. Peacekeeping represents an innovation. The first peacekeeping operation was established in 1956 in the Middle East, following the withdrawal of British, French, Israeli, and Egyptian forces from the Suez. It was thought that some military presence was needed to prevent the resumption of hostilities, to keep the peace, in other words. And so it was decided to send lightly armed soldiers to serve as a buffer between Israel and Egypt. Now, some people date peacekeeping from 1948, when the first UN observer mission was established to supervise the implementation of the truce after the 1948 War of Independence. But in that case, unarmed observers were deployed, whereas in 1956, lightly armed soldiers were used. Now, I want to say a few words about peacekeeping because it is, as I said, one of the most important contributions of the UN to international security. Because peacekeeping falls between pacific measures, Chapter 6 of the Charter, and enforcement measures, Chapter 7, it's sometimes referred to as Chapter 6.5. We can define peacekeeping operations as UN operations in which international personnel, military and civilian, are deployed with the consent of the parties and under UN command to help control and resolve an actual or potential international or internal conflict. The idea behind peacekeeping is a simple one. Suspend the conflict and thus lower the temperature and gain time to allow the parties to the conflict to negotiate a settlement that will resolve the conflict. In other words, peacekeeping is meant to create space for diplomacy to work. Peacekeeping is not peace enforcement, otherwise known as warfighting. Peacekeeping succeeds not because the UN deploys overwhelming force. UN peacekeepers, as I said, are only ever lightly armed, and that's for self-defense. No, peacekeeping succeeds because the parties to the conflict want the peacekeepers there, because as UN forces, they're trusted to be impartial. Now, what I've been describing is what's known as traditional peacekeeping, lightly armed soldiers deployed with the consent of the belligerents for the purpose of maintaining a ceasefire. And from 1956, or 1948, until about 1987, that's the only kind of peacekeeping there was. But then two things happened with the end of the Cold War. First, there was an explosion in the number of peacekeeping operations. From 1948 to 1987, there were a total of 13 UN peacekeeping operations. Since 1987, there have been 53 new operations. In other words, 4 times as many in the past 25 years as there were in the previous 40 years. This year alone, there have been 15 active UN peacekeeping operations. The total cost to the UN of running those operations, incidentally, is $7 billion US. Now, the UN is sometimes criticized for being bloated and inefficient, but just to put those costs into perspective, the US was estimated to be spending more than $6 billion a month on just its operations in Iraq in 2007. All right, so that's the first change that occurred with the end of the Cold War, a surge in the number of peacekeeping operations. The second important change that's taken place is with regard to the nature of peacekeeping. The UN mandate has expanded considerably in this regard. These forces are no longer just keeping the peace, they're also responsible for ensuring the delivery of humanitarian aid, for organizing and observing elections, for disarming and demobilizing armed forces, for training police, for verifying compliance with human rights agreements, among numerous other functions. Indeed, in a few cases, Kosovo and East Timor, for example, the UN's been responsible for governing the entire territory. These operations are sometimes referred to as complex peace operations to distinguish them from traditional peacekeeping. Okay, but peacekeeping is just one instrument that the UN uses to promote peace. There are three other broad areas of UN activity in relation to international security. And I'll mention them briefly.
Today I'm going to talk about the concept of work-life balance and how it applies to workers in the modern labour market. Traditionally, concerns in this area revolved around the amount of time individuals spent at work, in the office, balanced against time spent at home, in leisure activities or socialising with family and friends. So I'm going to start by looking at average working hours and how they've been affected by general trends in the labour market. However, we're also seeing an increasingly flexible labour market, with increased outsourcing and growing numbers of portfolio workers and freelancers. There's more pressure on workers to remain engaged with work outside of normal office hours. And with new technologies like smartphones and widespread internet access, the line between work and home life is becoming increasingly blurred. And this is called extensification or overflow. So in the second part of my presentation, I'll be looking at these phenomena and how they've affected people's ability to maintain a reasonable work-life balance. Okay, so let's start off by looking at how many hours workers in the UK spend at work on average. So here we have some statistics from the Office of National Statistics in the UK on working hours over the past few years. This first slide shows how the hours of everyone in employment have changed over the period from 1992 to 2011. And we can see that overall there's been a fall in the average working week from 38.1 hours in 1992 to 36.3 hours in 2011. If we look at some major sectors of the British economy, we can also see some differences in the average working hours. People working in construction have tended to work the longest hours, followed by those in manufacturing, with people in the service sector working the shortest hours. Although it should be noted that in the construction sector there's been a fall of around 3 hours in the average working week over the past decade, the past 10 years. What's important to understand when considering the fall in the average number of hours is the influence of a changing economy in the UK. To illustrate this, let's look at the share of employment across the different sectors in 1992. What we can see is that 68% of people were employed in the service sector, 21% in manufacturing, 7% in construction, and 4% in other areas such as agriculture. Now, looking at 2011, what we see is that the service sector has a much larger share of employment. And at the same time as this has gone up, the percentage of people employed in manufacturing has gone down. So why is this important? Well, if we go back to our first slide for a moment, we can see that people in manufacturing tend to work longer hours on average than those in the service sector. So if we have more people employed in services and fewer in manufacturing, this will act to reduce the average number of hours worked by the UK workforce as a whole. Okay, another important factor to consider is the effect on these figures of part-time working. Looking at this graph, we can see that the share of employment that is part-time working has been steadily increasing. So from around 24% in 1992 to 27% in the second quarter of 2011. The effect of this, of course, is to bring down the overall average number of hours for all those in work. Another interesting thing to look at is the percentage of people who are working part-time and who would like to work full-time. We can see that following the end of the 1990s recession, this was around 14%, but then this figure fell as the economy recovered. It started to rise again around 2004, and this increase accelerated at the start of the recession in 2008. In 2011, it stood at 16%, or around 1 in every 6 people working part-time. As I said in my introduction, statistics on working hours only tells part of the story. Achieving a good work-life balance doesn't just involve the number of official or paid hours employees spend at their desks, especially within the growing service sector. In a competitive job market, workers are expected to be flexible, both in terms of time and space. I want to refer to a study done by 2 researchers from the London School of Economics, Andy Pratt and Helen Jarvis. This was a study of new media workers in San Francisco. Pratt and Jarvis came across a number of families who were living in small, cramped city centre apartments rather than moving out to live in more affordable, more spacious areas outside the city. This was because both parents were working and felt that they needed to be at the centre of things for the sake of their careers. A city centre location was part of this. We also see this phenomenon in the UK, with its huge focus on London as the location with really good career prospects, but also very high housing and living costs. This pressure on workers to move to where the work is not only impacts on their standard of living, but also affects the rest of their family. Pratt and Jarvis also identify a phenomenon which they call overflow, where work tasks gradually creep in to people's home lives. This may be in quite obvious ways, like someone bringing their laptop home to look at some work after the kids have gone to bed, or it may be more insidious. Does checking your work email on your smartphone in the evening count as work, for example? One study by a UK employment law firm found that staff who were issued with BlackBerries or other mobile technology tended to work on average an extra 15 hours a week outside of the office. In the last few decades, we've seen a period of intensification of work practices, where new technologies have been brought in to make workers more efficient. And then this has had the effect of making work more intensive and increasing productivity. It's been argued that following this, the trend in recent years has been towards extensification, where employers seek to extend the role of their staff, providing them with smartphones, BlackBerries, whatever, so that they are always on call. Of course, from the employer's perspective, this is seen as a positive development, a way of increasing productivity, of getting the most out of your workforce. From the employee's point of view, though, it means their work inevitably overflows into their personal lives, their home lives. As mentioned, the line between work and home life starts to become blurred, and this can be seen as a negative thing, something that makes achieving a healthy work-life balance much more difficult. So this view of the modern labour market moves us away from a balance model, where workers are able to balance their work and home lives, towards a depletion model, where the demands of work, both inside the office and outside, take away from the time available for family and social activities.
Good afternoon. My name is George Pope. I'm a consultant physician working in the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford and an honorary senior clinical lecturer in the University of Oxford. And I have the privilege today of talking to you about stroke, an extremely exciting field of medicine evolving over the last 100 years and very, very quickly evolving over the last 10 years. So if I'd like to just go through the outline of my talk, which really looks at introducing stroke and how important a stroke is in our population, for patients and for society. What is a stroke, and try and go through some outline of giving you an understanding of what it means to have a stroke, the making of the diagnosis from the physician's point of view, the classification which is relevant to the prognosis, and the impact of stroke on people. I'd then like to go on to talk about the primary prevention, or the treatment strategy, which is threefold: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and the very exciting acute treatment, which has now emerged over the past 10 years, as I've said, with thrombolysis and hemicraniectomy. Thrombolysis is the use of clot-busting agents, and hemicraniectomy is the use of surgical procedures to relieve pressure in the brain, both exclusive treatments that are restricted to a very select population of stroke patients. So if I can go through some of the facts to begin. Every 2 seconds somebody in the world has a stroke, and every 6 seconds somebody in the world dies from a stroke. That leaves 5.8 million lives per year lost to stroke. And this is information coming from the World Health Report in 2007, the Geneva Report. Furthermore, it's the third commonest cause of death, with a third of strokes being fatal. 1 in 6 people in the world will have a stroke in their lifetime. It's unlikely to get through life without knowing somebody, a first degree relative or very close friend, who will not have a stroke. It is commoner than the combination of AIDS, TB and malaria. 1 in 6, as I've said, will have a recurrence. This is even more relevant in our current environment, where our population is aging. The risk of having a stroke is increased significantly by as one ages, and we are living in an aging population. And this is some data published by Professor Rothwell in The Lancet in 2005, which shows the increased prevalence of vascular disease, especially stroke, with age. In the EU population, the over 65 group will increase by 2050. It is estimated by Social Trends Office for National Statistics to be 29% of the population that will be over 65 years of age. What is a stroke? Well, stroke, the word stroke, comes from the Greek apoplexy, meaning to be struck down. And most people experience stroke in this way, that it is like a bolt of lightning out of the blue. What it is not is a CVA, which is the old term for a stroke, known as a cerebrovascular accident. And the terminology for stroke has changed somewhat over the last couple of years. The reasoning being mostly that this is not an accident, and we should consider it an emergency and something that is to be treated, and something that we look for risk factors for to try and prevent future problems and treat the current problem. Looking at the World Health Organization definition for stroke, which is slightly wordy and I will go through it, the definition from the World Health is a rapid developing clinical signs of focal or global disturbance of cerebral function, with symptoms lasting more than 24 hours or longer, leading to death with no apparent cause other than vascular origin. What does this mean? It means that this is a vascular event. Blood vessels are involved, not necessarily a neurological event where brain tissue may be involved, and it lasts for longer than 24 hours. The differentiation being events that are neurological events that are vascular lasting less than 24 hours are often called TIAs, or transient ischemic attacks, which are a forewarner of strokes and certainly increase your risk of subsequently having a stroke, but they are not an actual stroke. How do we make the diagnosis? Well, the diagnosis is made principally by history. So this is a detailed conversation with the patient outlining how this event occurred in the first instance. Examination is obviously important in terms of the deficit following the stroke and indeed the risk factors that caused the stroke or potentially caused the stroke. For example, problems with the carotid artery with narrowing or stenosis subsequently can result in increased stroke risk. Problems with the heart, with irregular heart rhythms, equally can relate in strokes from embolic or clots forming in the heart and moving to the brain. Blood pressure is of course vital. Glucose is vital for diabetes, and other tests are important such as brain scans. But ultimately the diagnosis is one made by discussing in detail with the patient what the problem was. Things that strokes can mimic are, we call them stroke mimics, are syncope, which are collapses usually secondary to blood pressure problems, a number of other causes also. Space-occupying lesions, for example tumours, metabolic disturbances such as blood problems with liver problems, kidney problems, high or low glucose, seizures and a post-seizure state or a post-ictal state. Migraine can rarely present with stroke-like symptoms. Acute confusional state. How else can we classify it? There is no one classification system, unfortunately, that encompasses stroke completely, and that is important. The reason we classify is to gain an understanding of the underlying cause and the underlying prognosis. Radiologically, i.e. through CAT scans or MRI scans, we can classify strokes into either ischemic or hemorrhagic. Ischemic strokes are where a clot forms somewhere along a blood vessel and the blood supply to the tissue that blood vessel is supplying is blocked and stopped. That causes damage to the brain tissue and it's called an ischemic stroke. This is the commonest cause of a stroke, with 80% of strokes presenting as ischemic strokes. Hemorrhagic strokes are where there is a bleed from a blood vessel. This is 20% of the stroke population and is broken down to primary bleeds in the brain tissue or intracerebral hemorrhages, or bleeds outside of the brain in the subarachnoid space, the space under the meninges, the lining of the brain. How do we approach the treatment of stroke? So, primary prevention in the population group, reducing smoking, treating blood pressure, improving diet, and promoting exercise is obviously the principal strategy to prevent strokes. In those who have risk factors, and they are diabetes, high blood pressure, previous warnings or TIAs as we've discussed earlier, these groups of patients benefit from treatment strategies that are rather more accelerated than the normal population. For example, starting aspirin for treating blood pressure very well, and these have all been shown to reduce the risk of subsequent strokes. We all know about aspirin, and it's been in treatment vogue for many years, and that was the acute management for stroke up to 10, maybe 15 years ago. What's very exciting now is the acute treatment of stroke with interventions and with rehabilitation. And one mightn't think that rehabilitation is that exciting, but in fact it is. And it is probably the best proven treatment for any stroke patient. Secondary prevention I'll come on to in a minute. So, looking at rehabilitation, stroke unit patients versus non-stroke unit patients. The Cochrane report in 2001 looked at the number of people who returned home and the number of patients that you need to treat in order to get an extra person home between a stroke population treated in a stroke unit versus that treated on a normal, non-organised acute medical ward. I don't use the term non-organised with any disparity, but it is organised care, organised stroke specialist care versus ordinary hospital care. 5 more return home, 4 fewer died, and 3 less are institutionalised from 100 patients. And this is significant, and this is a real benefit to treatment. This is real patient impact.
So I said that this lecture was going to focus on 3 main questions. We've spent a lot of time on that first question of what is university learning. We've explored it from several different perspectives so that you could have a sense of what the fundamental cultural assumptions are that underpin the educational process in English-speaking universities. So what I'd like to do now is to focus on the second major question of the talk, which is how you can make the most of your university education in an English-speaking country. So how can you engage in deep learning, if we use Salyer's term, or higher order thinking, if we use Bloom's term, or to use Newman's terms, the collision of mind with mind. So let's take a moment to do our third reflection. And here I want you to think of a situation in which you learned something deeply in the terms we've just described. And what did you do? And what helped you the most? Good. We'll look at that more closely in the tutorials later, because I know I don't want to keep you over time today. So what I want to focus on is the process of university learning in English-speaking countries. Now I'm hoping that some of the notes that you've written down to yourself include some of these key bullet points. That the way in which you can learn involves reading, yes, it involves listening, and particularly listening actively. So I've built in these reflection prompts throughout this lecture today in order to help you to listen actively, to help you to think about the key points in the lecture as well as just listen. Because I know that if all you did was listen to my voice for an hour, I would be waking you up to leave the room at the end. So I want to keep you awake with having you think about things along the way. And it's important that you take that mindset into any lecture that you have, even if the lecturer doesn't do what I've done today, which is pause throughout the lecture. You should still be thinking to yourself, generating questions or paying attention to the questions that the lecturer might be posing, so that you are actively engaging with the content, even if the lecture is going through quite continuously. Another key process of learning in universities is by writing. And often we mistakenly, I think of writing as something you do after you've learned something. You read about it, and all you have to do is write it up. But actually, I want to challenge you to think that writing is, in fact, a part of that learning process, that we write in order to understand. We write in order to clarify our thinking, in much the same way that Socrates engaged his students in a dialogue, where they said something and then explored it further and further.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Professor Angus Hawkins, and I'm here to talk to you this morning about a man called, what I have called the Forgotten Prime Minister. Perhaps I should start by telling you about a parlour game perhaps I've been playing with acquaintances over the last few years, who, when I've met them, have asked me, Angus, what are you working on now? And I say, I'm writing a biography. They then say, oh, interesting, who is your biography of? And it's at this point I ask them some questions. I say, well, I'm writing a biography of the first British statesman to become Prime Minister 3 times. There's a pause, and they try and guess who it is that I'm talking about, and they will suggest Gladstone or Disraeli or Salisbury, to all of which I say no, 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 no. And then I say, okay, I'll make it easier for you. He is the longest serving party leader in modern British politics, led the Conservative Party for 22 years. And again, various suggestions, but almost invariably not the correct answer. And then I say, okay, I'll make it very, very easy for you. I'm writing a biography of the man who abolished slavery in the British Empire. And at that point, people usually begin to look slightly embarrassed and are still unsuccessful. Over a period of about 3 or 4 years, when I was having these conversations, the number of people who could give me the correct answer, who could tell me who I was writing about, you could number on the fingers of one hand. As a result, the biography that I wrote, I entitled The Forgotten Prime Minister, because the 14th Earl of Derby, who indeed was the first British statesman to become Prime Minister 3 times, led the Conservative Party for 22 years, from 1846 to 1868, and in 1833, as Colonial Secretary, abolished slavery in the British Empire, has been largely forgotten, has been, as it were, airbrushed out of our history of modern British politics and British conservatism. So this was very interesting to me as a historical problem. The historical question: why has Lord Derby been written out of our history of modern British politics and our history of British conservatism? Why has he been airbrushed away? Why has he been forgotten?
Right, okay, I'm going to be talking about the mind-body problem, and it's going to be a really brief introduction. It really is going to be brief. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the mind-body problem, and I'm going to set out for you why the relationship between the mind and the body is considered problematic, and also why it continues to be problematic. This problem isn't going to go away. So, going right back to the beginning, there was René Descartes, and there he is. He wrote a wonderful book called The Meditation on First Philosophy. I'm sure you've all heard of that. If you haven't read it, do try it. It's very easy to read. The ideas in it are very difficult, but it is easy to read, so try it. On the basis of conceptual analysis, and we'll talk about that in a second, Descartes drew a very sharp distinction between the mind and the body. And just before we go on to the distinction that he drew, let's have a look at what conceptual analysis is. Tell me what's characteristic of a triangle? It has 3 sides. Okay, must it have 3 sides? Are there any triangles that don't have 3 sides? No, there aren't, are there? What you were doing there, notice there isn't a triangle that I can see in this room. What you were doing was reflecting on your concept of a triangle, analysing it to see what was necessary for something to be a triangle, and what you could see is quite clearly, if it hasn't got 3 sides, it isn't a triangle. Is that right? Okay, you were using the tool of conceptual analysis, and that's what Descartes used with respect to the mind and the body. And what he did, when he thought of the mind and thought, okay, what is it that's characteristic of mind? What is it without which the mind wouldn't exist? And then he looked at the body and he thought, what is it without which the body wouldn't exist? And he came up with 2 things. He identified the essential property of the mind as thinking. So if you didn't think, would you exist? Your body might, but would you exist if you didn't think?
How about feeling?
Okay, we could add feeling to that, and in fact I'm happy to do so at the moment. If you didn't think and feel, could you exist? If you had no thoughts, no feelings, no sensations, no consciousness at all, would you exist? No. Well, that's the conclusion that Descartes came to. He thought without consciousness, it wouldn't be me. Even if my body was around but there was no consciousness, it wouldn't be me, because what's important to me, what's essential to me, is that I think. That's where he got his famous I'm thinking, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. He then looked at the essential property of a body. So if we take a physical object, I wish I had a solid one here, but I don't, but this pen will do. What is it that's essential to a physical object like this? Is it its shape? You could have a physical object with a different shape, couldn't you? What is it? And what he thought was its space fillingness, its extension, which means solidity or space fillingness. So there couldn't be a physical object, thinks Descartes, that isn't extended in space. We're going to do a Cartesian thought experiment for ourselves. So let's do that. I'm going to use the flip chart.
Another part of the learning process are laboratories or practical experiences where you may get demonstrations of key ideas, or you get to experience the process of the scientific disciplines in particular. Discussion, debate, critique, and questioning are also all a significant part of the learning process in English-speaking universities. And I realize that for many students coming from other cultures, this can feel very uncomfortable. That you may be accustomed to listening to the teacher as the authority, as the one who knows the answers, and that in order to be respectful to them, you ought not to ask too many questions. You should simply take that as given. But the way we operate in English-speaking universities is quite different than that. And you'll generally find that there are discussion sections, tutorials, small class settings where you are expected to bring questions. Not only questions about the content that you've been reading, but also to question other students in the class who may be putting an idea out there that you think isn't quite right, or maybe it's a pretty good idea, but if you can help them to clarify it, it will be an even better idea. And you can expect that your teachers will do that to you, and it's quite all right to do that with your teachers. So that's a really different way of operating than the situations that some of you may have come from. And it's important that you understand that so that you can take the best advantage of your university education. And we've talked already a lot in the first segment of this lecture about the cultural roots of that critical thinking approach. And finally, I want to encourage you to think about developing and supporting your own arguments, to think about the process of education as an opportunity to find your own voice, to develop your own thoughts about the subject at hand, and also to think about what your place is then in what I'm calling a remade world. Because as you learn in this deep way, your perspectives will be challenged. Your assumptions will be challenged. You'll see things you didn't see before. And you'll start to see the world and yourself in it differently. And that's part of the process. It's not always comfortable, but it's part of the process when you're doing it really well. So bear with it and embrace it as much as possible and get the supports that you need so that you can experience it that fully.
Good morning, and thank you for choosing to attend my presentation today. So as you can see, I'm going to be looking at the challenges facing the global pharmaceutical market today and how those challenges can be addressed. I'd like to start with some background information on the pharmaceutical market as a whole. As I'm sure you know, in the majority of cases, the price of goods and services in a particular market normally find their equilibrium through the meeting of supply and demand. In other words, the price of goods or services reflects both the availability and the demand. So if demand rises and a lot of people want something, then if the supply remains at the same level, the price will go up. And if that supply increases, we'd expect the price to come back down, and vice versa. If demand falls, the price goes down until the supply is reduced, and so on. But as we'll see, the pharmaceutical market is different. the pharmaceutical market is not a perfect market where supply perfectly matches demand. And this leads us to the situation we have today. So, I'd just like to outline the situation with regard to expenditure on medical products globally. We'll start with the figures from 1990 and 2000, and then we'll look at the most recently available figures, published in 2011, which come from the World Health Organization, the WHO. And I should say that I'm basing all of my figures on publications by the WHO. The WHO is the world's most visible global health organization with a 193 country membership, which means it operates at both a global and a local level. This global reach means that they are able to collect data from more countries than any other organization. Okay, as we can see, this table shows the private and government per capita expenditure on pharmaceuticals in 1990 and 2000. All the figures are in US dollars. There are several things going on here. First, private expenditure on pharmaceuticals outweighs government expenditure in all income categories, so high, middle and low incomes. Second, the total expenditure increased very substantially in this decade. If we compare the totals of the years 1990 and 2000, we can see that the increase is around 50% overall, with higher increases in the middle income countries. And third, there is a significant variation between countries with different incomes. If we look at the year 2000, the governments of low-income countries spent just over $1 per capita on pharmaceuticals. Contrast this with the expenditure of high-income countries, $167. This is a huge difference, obviously. There are some more recent figures, and these seem to show a similar trend, that per capita pharmaceutical expenditure has been increasing steadily for a number of years. In 2005 to 2006, this ranged from $7.61 US in low-income countries up to $431.6 in high-income countries. Compare this with 1995, when the highest rate of increase was in low and middle-income countries. The WHO figures allow us to make some interesting observations regarding inequalities in expenditure. For example, 16% of the world's population currently live in high-income countries, and they account for over 78% of global expenditure on medicines and medical products. Now, total pharmaceutical expenditure, or TPE, as it's often referred to, TPE is much higher in high-income countries, as you might expect. However, compared with low-income countries, a much smaller proportion of this money is spent on actual medicines or drugs. Since 1995, the private share of TPE has been increasing in low and middle income countries, but not in high income countries, and I'll come back to this public-private distinction a little later. So, having looked at the global market in pharmaceuticals, I want to now look at some of the associated problems. As I said at the beginning, the pharmaceutical market is not a perfect market where supply balances with demand, and I'd like to explore some of the reasons why. In this section of my talk, I'll be basing my material on the work of Wally and Wright, and by the way, I'll give you all the references at the end. Okay, the pharmaceutical market is a bit of a special case for a number of reasons. First of all, in general, consumers are not particularly well informed about the medical products they're using. Consumers tend to be better informed about products like, well, the clothes they buy, food products, white goods and the gadgets they use and so on. Typically, most people don't know much about the quality and the safety of their medicines, and they tend to take these just on trust. And they're not especially well informed about either of the effectiveness or of their medication or how appropriate a particular medication can be for their condition. Secondly, there actually isn't much competition in this market. There are a large number of consumers, or potential consumers, in the world. In effect, the entire population of the world is a potential consumer. If you compare that for a moment with manufacturers of other kinds of products, let's say, for example, sat-navs, you're immediately limited to consumers who own a car. Nobody is going to buy a sat-nav if they don't have a car to put it in. But potentially everyone is a consumer of pharmaceutical products. And while there's an enormous number of consumers, there are relatively few suppliers. Basically, there are healthcare providers, purchasers, and manufacturers. Thirdly, there is the issue of monopolies. Manufacturers are known to create monopolies through the use of patents, which protect their medicines from being copied by other manufacturers for a fixed number of years. Manufacturers can also patent their manufacturing processes, which makes it even harder for competitors. Related to this, there's also brand loyalty, just as there is in many other sectors, which is achieved partly at least through intensive marketing. A great deal of money is spent on marketing pharmaceutical products in high-income countries, like the United States. There have also been cases of price fixing by producer cartels in order to keep market prices artificially high. Finally, I just want to mention external factors, externalities, which exist in the sector. This means that treatment for some conditions, especially communicable diseases like tuberculosis and some sexually transmitted infections, benefits not only the patient receiving the treatment, but also the wider public, because their risk of contracting the disease or infection is also reduced. So I hope this analysis shows that the pharmaceutical market is quite unlike most other markets. I would go as far as to say it is a market which has failed. It is a failed market. A key point to emerge from this is that the financing of medicines and the balance between government and private financing plays a critical role in the market. So, I'd like to propose 6 ways of keeping costs down and improving the profile of the pharmaceutical market. Most parties agree that medicine costs need to be kept down, so national governments have a key role to play in drawing up principled lists of cost-effective medicines. Alongside this, the generic market can be promoted so that pharmacists can replace more expensive branded consumer drugs with the equivalent generic ones, which tend to be much cheaper. Therapeutic substitution is also possible. In other words, adapting a particular patient's therapy, moving to a lower cost drug program.
So today we are going to focus this lecture on community ecology. But first of all, we must recap what is ecology. So it's the study of interactions between organisms and their environments. And I have this array of leaflets around the outside just to show the sheer scope that ecology covers, especially in terms of the scale from molecular through to the landscape level. Now, in terms of organisms, we're obviously talking about individual forms of life. And in terms of the environments, we have the abiotic, the non-living part of the environment, and the biotic, so that's the living part of the environment. And we're going to go into more detail about that a bit later on. So first of all, the abiotic factors, these non-living components, they include aspects such as water, wind, and solar radiation. And on the southern slope, you can see in the foreground, which is currently in sun, it's likely that that slope receives more solar radiation than the slope opposite, the northern facing. But in reverse, actually the northern slope is likely to be wetter than the southern slope because it will have water fed down through the entire catchment onto that point. And in the centre of the photograph, you can see this rocky area, and that area is likely to be exposed to more salt water and potentially wind than these two grassland areas. And the key point is that the environmental conditions that are present in these three areas will suit some populations of some species, but not others. So what is a population? It's individuals of a single species living together in one geographical location at the same time. Now, when we talk about species, that is organisms which are able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. And when we talk about the geographical area, the physical area in which these species live, that's called their habitat. So habitats such as forests or ponds or meadows are shared by many coexisting populations. And an assemblage of two or more of these populations is known as a community. And you've probably observed already from this diagrammatic representation of a grassland that some species are more associated with particular areas than others. So in the bottom of the diagram, you can see a click beetle species and a weevil species, and they're particularly associated with the root systems, in contrast to the carder bee, which is specifically associated with the flowers and the pollen. And then in the centre, there is the orb web spider, which is actually using the architecture of the grassland itself. And these areas are sometimes called an ecological niche. They don't just have to be a physical area, they are specifically the conditions and the resources that those species need to survive. And they can include a range of temperatures, and they can include a temporal range as well, so whether the species is coming out at day or at night. And this means that ecologically similar species can actually coexist in the same community, especially if their niches are able to differ by one or two significant ways. And this is what we call resource petitioning. So this diagrammatic representation of a grassland shows clearly a range of sward structures. You've got some tussocked, thick areas of grass compared to some open, bare patches. And this is really important because it enables quite a large array of niches to be available for a range of species. Now, some species may need to reside in this open, bare patch where maybe the temperature will be different, the moisture will be different than inside this tussocked grassland area. Some species may actually need both of those areas as part of their niche. So for example, a wading bird species such as the lapwing will need the tussocked area to shelter from predators and also to nest, but they will need this open, bare patch to be able to probe for food, to be able to probe for invertebrates. Now, this niche separation issue is really well represented in the spider community. And even within 1 metre square of this particular grassland area, you will see ground-dwelling spiders, which will be hunting at that lower level. And at the same time, you'll see orb web spiders, and they will be up in the grassland in their webs. So within a small area, you will have very similar ecological species, but are able to coexist in a small area due to this niche separation. So how are communities actually structured? First of all, we look at species richness. So within a community, there can be different types of species, and then there are relative abundance of those species. Some will be more common than others. Then we have the physical characteristics of the organisms. So for example, in very arid areas, some plants will have very thick, succulent leaves, and this is to reduce evapotranspiration. So that is to stop water evaporating from the leaf. And that's an adaptation to that environment. And then lastly, the trophic relationships among interacting populations within a community. This refers to the way in which energy is transferred through the system. So you remember from biology, school days, you've been taught that green plants had a compound called chlorophyll, and that was able to capture energy from the sun. And by using carbon dioxide and water through a process called photosynthesis, they were able to generate a carbohydrate, an energy source. So how is this energy transferred through the community? Well, basically, it's transferred through a series of what we call food chains. And these are intricately linked to create a food web, which you can see here. Now, at the very base of the food web, we have the phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are really the foundation of oceanic food webs. And they contain chlorophyll, so they are generating this carbohydrate source. Now, in turn, they are fed upon by the krill, which are herbivores, so they're primary consumers. And in turn, they are fed upon by the leopard seal, which we call a predator, but we also call a carnivore. And a third title is a secondary consumer. And so energy is fed up through these chains, and actually only 10% of the original energy is passed on at each stage. So that puts a limitation on the number of steps you can have in any one food chain. And it's usually about 3 or 4, which is what you can see in this oceanic one here. So you've got the phytoplankton, step 1, and the krill, step 2, leopard seal, step 3, and the smaller toothed whale, step 4. And the reason that you can only have that many levels is because these higher trophic level species require to consume an enormous amount of these lower trophic level species to be able to survive. So there is only a certain level of primary producers, and so only a certain number of the higher trophic species can be supported. So we've talked a little bit about interactions between populations in the community. And we've touched on herbivory already. So there's another example here. This is an epilobium species. That's the primary producer, the plant. And to the right is a hawk moth caterpillar. So that's our herbivore. That's the primary consumer. And we've also touched upon predation. So these are secondary consumers. So on the lower right-hand side, we have the water vole. That's a herbivore. And on the left is an American mink, which is our secondary consumer. So these are some very, very basic sort of connections in the food web. But there are 3 other interactions within the populations that I want to talk about. First of all is parasitism. So this is a symbiotic interaction in which the parasite actually derives part or all of its nourishment from a host, which is either harmed or in some cases is actually killed in the process. Now, the first example I want to give you is a hemiparasitic plant. And by hemiparasitic, we mean that it only derives part of its resources from its host. So this example is Rhinanthus minor, the yellow rattle, which is depicted here in the photograph. And it latches on to competitive grasses such as Holcus lanatus. And by doing that, it impedes their growth. So this is a fantastic plant to aid restoration of grasslands, for example, because by sowing out the Rhinanthus minor seeds, you can actually impact on some competitive grasses, which opens out the sward to enable less competitive herbaceous plants to come through. The second example I want to show you are Parasitic Hymenoptera. So these are the parasitic wasps. And here this depicts a Chilean rose, which is actually a tarantula, which is about this size, just to give you an idea of scale. I mean, it's so large, you can see it walking across the road when you're driving along. So this photograph was actually taken in Argentina. And it's been paralysed by the parasitic wasp, which is now dragging it off to the nest. And it will be brought down into the nest, and the eggs will either be laid on top or within that host. And when the eggs emerge and the larvae emerge, they will feed on that host. So ultimately, this parasitism case will actually involve the death of the host. So the second example I want to talk about is mutualism. Now, mutualism basically means that there's an interaction between two different species, and the interaction results in a mutual benefit for both species. So there's nothing more classic than the example of the large blue butterfly and the red ant interaction. So basically, the large blue butterfly caterpillar feeds on wild thyme and marjoram, and when it reaches its third instar level, it starts secreting a honeydew substance which attracts the red ant species. The red ants then carry that caterpillar down into their nest, still feeding on this honeydew secretion. And the caterpillar there can actually feed on the red ant eggs. So there's this mutual benefit from both sides. And the large blue butterfly will end up hibernating over winter there, so they'll turn into a chrysalis. And in fact, incredibly, the large blue butterfly can actually mimic the pheromones of the red ant and noises that the red ant makes just to ensure its survival in the nest. Now, when the next season comes around, the blue butterfly emerges and is actually taken up to the surface by the red ants, which then surround it and actually protect it as it pumps up its wings, ready for its first flight. It's an incredible relationship, a very classic example. So in terms of ecosystems, they are extremely vital to our survival, as I've said. And back in 2001, 2005, a global Millennium ecosystem assessment took place. And the key objective was to assess the consequences of ecosystem change for our well-being. And this encompassed 95 countries, phenomenal number of experts. So it was the first and the largest assessment of the health of ecosystems in the UK. And effectively, these ecosystem processes were split up into 4 key categories that are called ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services are basically the benefits that we gain as human beings from these processes. So they split it into supporting services, so that includes the nutrient cycling, the primary production, how the energy gets into our system in the first place, provisioning, obviously we gain food and fuel from these systems, regulating, so food, flood regulation and water purification, and then the cultural aspect, the aesthetics. But fundamentally, these systems are very vulnerable, and because of the level in which we rely upon them, it is our responsibility to maintain them and to ensure their continuity. So the focus for the future is very much on reconnecting our fragmented landscape, and this is going to be vital in terms of continuing these ecological processes and more fundamentally maintaining the ecosystem services that we very much require for our own survival.
Now, before we, given that it's all difficult, just to describe something in society, just to get some measures of anything is extremely difficult, costly, time-consuming. We really ought to find out what's already known. We need to know whether it's worth doing this research. I think just about everybody listening to this lecture will have be familiar with the idea of a literature review, you can go and see what's been published on a particular research topic. But undertaking a literature review can be a complicated and time-consuming business in itself. There are different forms of review. A narrative review would try to tell the story of how research has developed in a broad area over perhaps a number of years, different traditions, try to make sense of it all. And it would give a good flavour for what's gone on in a particular area. But increasingly, people are suggesting that actually we should approach our reviewing systematically. This doesn't mean that people who've done narrative reviews were utterly unsystematic. You know, they just kind of went into the library, put anything off the shelf and trying to have a quick look, and well, they were totally unsystematic. But systematic reviews are systematic in a very, very specific sense. They have a specific search strategy to address a particular research question. That search strategy needs to be set out in detail. So, for example, you would say which library databases you'd searched, on which day even. Yeah? You'd identify the terms that you put into that search, the number of hits that you got back, why you chose to read the ones you chose, how you extracted the data from those that you chose to pursue. And in fact, you'd almost certainly involve another researcher. It wouldn't be a lone effort sitting in a library. There may be a team of a dozen people working across the world, carving up this literature into manageable parcels, extracting the data from it and evaluating it, and then comparing notes with one another, cross-referring certain samples to check they've come up with the same conclusions. Systematic reviews are there to try and make sure that we don't repeat research that doesn't need doing, and that we know which research does need doing. Obviously that then begs the question of how we would combine this research, and synthesis is probably one of the most important things going on. If there's been all this investment of time and money in research, we really ought to be in a position to combine it so that we get the full picture. There are no research studies that have given the definitive answer on any interesting question. It takes multiple studies coming at from different perspectives, repeating things to check against error, to really let us know that we know an answer or have a good idea of what the answer is on a particular question. Often that's done statistically with what's called meta-analysis, where you can take the statistics reported in a range of studies, combine the data, and do other forms of analysis that let you work out what the effects are over much larger populations and different circumstances. Okay. Well, let's assume we were doing something there around happiness. Finding happiness, well, there's a question of finding happiness in our own lives, but leave that to one side. The question of finding research on happiness, as you can see, it's actually not going to be very easy, because happiness isn't a term that's very easy to define. It's not one that everybody would approach in the same way. So if you're trying to find literature on happiness, what search terms are you going to put in? Well, you might use happiness itself, but just sitting there, you would be able to come up with lots of other terms. You might come up with broad kind of synonyms like contentment, maybe satisfaction, life satisfaction. Maybe you're familiar with some of the literature, so you come up with terms like well-being, quality of life. And you may, of course, come up with other things which are kind of relate to happiness but are quite different concepts. So lack of anxiety, lack of distress might be qualities associated with happiness. You're not going to be very happy if you are very anxious and distressed. So mapping out those search terms is quite a complicated thing to do unless you're working in a field that's very, very closely defined, very technical, and where there's a long established kind of tradition of ways to approach it. So you may need a theory to help guide you in selecting those terms and knowing what you're going to mean by them. Okay. Well, so we've sorted all that out. We know what humanity is, we know what we want to do, and we know how we're going to investigate it. We also want to think about whether we're going to do any harm. Because our orientation to this is that we're going to do good. None of us have come here into doing social research in order to foster some kind of deliberately malicious ends. But it's very easy to do harm without intending it, and the research literature is littered with examples of that. Research governance is what institutions like this university and others do to try and keep an eye on how research is being undertaken, to try to make sure that it is properly conducted. Key aspects of that are research ethics and research integrity. In relation to research ethics, you probably heard the term informed consent, and probably familiar with the idea that research subjects, either the people being researched, should have anonymity. those have not been assumptions that have been made throughout the history of the development of social research. And there are many debates about how these things can be conducted. In the context of happiness, it's rather obvious that if you're going to start asking people about happiness, you may well draw them into consideration of unhappiness. If you're going to explore things like anxiety and distress and people's circumstance in their lives, it's very, very likely that you're going to go into territory that may be really quite uncomfortable for them and, of course, for the researcher. So if you are part of a research program and you're employing a lot of researchers, you've got to look out for their well-being as well as your research subjects. So there's the ethics of the research process, also research integrity, and the P word, plagiarism, falsification. It's rather shocking and rather disappointing, but there are many examples where researchers have cut corners under pressure to publish, under pressure to produce results, and I'm afraid plagiarism and falsification of results, plagiarism being where you rip off somebody else's work and present it as your own, and falsification where you literally just stick in the numbers that suit you. In terms of research outcomes, there are also problems for researchers because somebody will have funded the research. You hope people will use it, but they may not use it in the ways that you intend. Use of research in the politics of blame is a big issue, for example, in educational research, where identifying things which appear to show weaknesses in one set of schools or whatever can result in consequences that certainly weren't intended by the researchers. In the context of research into happiness, because people tend to be very resilient and actually report much higher levels of happiness than you might expect, that can result in, there's no problem. Let's ignore the other difficulties that people run into because they're saying on this scale 7.7 happiness, that's fine. Okay, so these outcomes can be ones that aren't intended but which the researchers really need to think about in the way they manage what they're doing. Okay, so let's go on to some of the nitty-gritty about the kind of data we might need to gather. Obviously, we're doing it to answer specific research questions, and that's something that has a whole field in itself on how you craft good research questions. But let's just point out for the sake of this lecture that you need to have some and you need to know what they mean. But you're then going to have to deal with how you're going to gather your data and how it's going to be analysed. The two terms that you'll have already encountered here are quantitative and qualitative approaches. So these are broad orientations to the way in which the research is going to be conducted, and they're also a hint to certain assumptions about epistemology, for example, about what you take to be the forms of knowledge that are achievable in your research. So let's, rather than just do qualitative, quantitative as the main headlines, let's just consider the aspects of those two in relation to the questions about how we gather relevant data and then how we analyse it. Quantitative approaches turn things into numbers, and the main ways they're conducted are through, for example, surveys. They may be questionnaires. Those questionnaires may be conducted in a variety of ways. They may be interviews. You may do it online on the web. You may have somebody phone you up and go through a set of questions with you. Obviously, there's also experimental designs. An experiment is where you'd have a particular action or intervention taken, and you'd allocate people to receive that or to receive some kind of control. Could be nothing, could be a placebo as they're called. So you're making comparisons between a control group and an intervention group to see whether the intervention has had any kinds of effects. Were they good ones, were they bad ones, and what might they mean? Some of the key concepts, obviously if you're surveying there'll be a population, but in relation to happiness index, for example, for the UK, that population is millions and millions of people, and you may well not be feasible to reach all those people, too expensive, too impractical. So you're going to work with a sample of those people. In selecting your sample, you've got to think about how you're actually going to get the information about those people, how you're going to reach them. So you'll have a sampling frame, as it's called. So for an example of a sampling frame would be the electoral roll, which is a specific database. Now, the electoral roll will not actually have in it all the people who are eligible in principle to vote. It has the people who are on the electoral roll. So there'll be omissions, but you'll have to make that kind of decision about how you're going to sample and what frame you will use to conduct the research. You're probably going to be considering randomization because arguably the best way to avoid bias is not to select people, it is to randomly identify them using some computer-generated number or some other method that just applies a random step to selection of people. You might randomize people, then you won't get bias in your results. You won't accidentally draw unduly from a particular part of your population. Because if you're dealing with a very large sample from a very large population, randomization could easily result in unequal representation between men and women, for example. So there you might do what's called stratification. You would make a decision informed by a certain theory that gender differences are important, and you might decide to randomize within those two chunks. So you're stratifying those two chunks, and then you're randomizing within males and females.